Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon from wherever you might be joining, and welcome back to our Shangchung UK Light of Kailash lecture series. Today, we're happy to be welcoming Professor Natasha Mikles from Texas State University. Professor Mikles has been researching the epic of Gesar of Ling in Tibetan studies for many years, and she's also written a book about death during COVID-19. So it's a pleasure to welcome her today. Uh, It's morning for those of you in the US and evening for those of us in Asia. So I won't say much more. Natasha will talk now and then she'll tell us about narratives and Buddhist tales and also more.
Mhm.
So please, let's welcome her and we can ask some questions at the end. So thank you everybody for joining us and welcome Natasha.
Thank you all so much for having me. I'm speaking to you all now from Texas, where it is just morning here, and I'm excited to speak with y'all. I was asked to talk a little bit about how I got into Tibetan studies and Himalayan studies more generally. I always think this is a really interesting question. Um, I I kind of wish I had a better answer for this. As I'm going to talk about, I was actually raised Roman Catholic, and I think like a lot of college students, especially in America, when I went to college, I decided that I wasn't Catholic anymore. I was a Buddhist. And I didn't actually know anything about Buddhism. What that mostly meant for me would be that I would meditate really ostentatiously in public places and use that to kind of represent how Buddhist I was. Um, and I would preface things by saying, well, as a Buddhist, I think we should get Chinese food or something like that. So I was not perhaps a very good Buddhist. I then took a course on Buddhism actually with Kevin Vose at William and Mary, where I did my undergraduate. And in that, I learned that I was actually not, in fact, a Buddhist, but also got very interested in all the ways that I wasn't a Buddhist, and became very interested in the kind of cultural perceptions that I think a lot of Americans had about Buddhism and how um, they often didn't really match up with Buddhist texts and kind of Buddhist history itself. So I then went and lived in Buddhist monasteries in Japan for several months to continue to learn about how I wasn't a Buddhist. And then when I came back, actually introduced to the Gesar epic by Kevin Vose, who knew that I loved Lord of the Rings and kind of other sort of epic poetry. So it really is the Gesar epic that got me into Tibetan studies. I then went on and did my master's at University of Chicago, working with Christian Wedemeyer and working on translation habits there, and then lived at Tibet University. I was one of the last two classes of foreign international students at Tibet University, where I got to experience kind of the Gesar epic and Tibetan culture in real time. Where I grew up in kind of rural Pennsylvania, there were not very many Tibetans. So that was such a blessing. And then came back and did my PhD at University of Virginia before coming here to Texas State University. Like I said, I wish there was sort of a better answer, but I think this kind of misunderstanding of cultures is what got me into kind of Tibetan studies and Himalayan studies, and is arguably what has kept me here. So. So with that kind of thinking about it, though, I actually do think that the kind of element of being raised Catholic is going to be actually really important to what I'm talking about today. I want to talk about narratives and I want to talk about stories. And the basic thrust of my conversation today is that narrative is as important a tool for teaching and explaining and actually working through ideas of the Dharma as sutras and tantras. Um, Even though we might not like always think about it in quite that way, I think that narrative is not just a kind of fun, fanciful, or frivolous thing that gets added on to kind of like a core Buddhist doctrine, but actually is in itself a way of thinking through Buddhist doctrine. And I think about this a lot with my kind of Catholic upbringing. In Catholicism, there's this idea of transubstantiation, which is this very fancy word that means that the priest blesses the body or blesses the kind of bread and wine, and it is believed to actually become the body and blood of Jesus. I never knew what that word was until I was a sophomore in college, but when I was a little girl, I knew the host was important because there were stories of saints that would hold up the Eucharistic host and use that to fight off armies. There were stories of priests using the host to cure people. And so I think in that way, stories are a really important tool for explaining and thinking about religious doctrines. Now, my research specialty is popular stories about hell, and especially the Gesar epic. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Gesar epic. But I was also asked to talk about Rinpoche's really beautiful artwork. And I was really drawn to his sixth painting, which does depict hell a little bit, which talks about the story of Nanda and the Buddha. I'm going to talk about that a little bit at the end, but it actually inspired the title of my talk. In my academic work, I often talk about all the various things that hell does in the Buddhist tradition. And I actually usually emphasize that it is not just the big stick that scares Buddhists. But with this talk, I actually want to think a little bit more about when it is the big stick that scares Buddhists. That when a fear of hell or fear of negative rebirths or bad karma or whatever have you gets employed as a tool that convinces people to follow Buddhist practices or to kind of teach Buddhist truths. So with that in mind, I'm actually going to start by sharing three of my favorite Buddhist stories with y'all and use that as a jumping off point to think about larger conversations about why narrative is an effective teaching tool and what narrative does uniquely that maybe perhaps other types of traditional Buddhist texts like sutras and tantras don't. Conveniently, the stories I've selected do kind of each epitomize this. So I'll kind of just dig on in. So I actually want to think a little bit about, with my first thing, my first kind of point. So I want to think about how stories provide a kind of multi-layered elaboration of Buddhist truths. And I think that multi-layered part is important. To do this, I want to talk about the story, one of my favorite ones about the courtesan Sirma. You might be familiar with this story. It's one of the oldest stories in Buddhism, and actually we can trace it back to the Dhammapala. And in the story, Sirma was a courtesan, and she was one who attracted a very, very, very high price to spend time with her. There's a rather convoluted story about how that involves ladles of oil and a wife who'd rather listen to the Dharma than sleep with her husband, and her kind of own prickly pride that is about how she became a Buddhist. I'm actually going to talk about that part of the story at the end. But for this point, Surma, she is a Buddhist, and every day she would host a whole congregation of monks at her house. And she would let them eat the fine food usually reserved for her clients, and she herself would serve the monks. And when doing this, the monks would speak of her beauty far and wide until word reached a young monk who lived outside of town. And he wanted to travel to the city to see Sirma's beauty himself. So he journeys into the city to come see Sirma and to feast upon her fine food and to feast upon her beauty, and he instantly falls in love with her. He loses all interest in his Buddhist practice, and he just lays in bed and pines for the beautiful Sirma. So, however, Sirma dies unexpectedly. Our lovesick little monk, he doesn't know it yet because he's too busy laying in bed bemoaning his fate and pining for this woman who is now dead. So the Buddha, and I think it's actually kind of funny. You can imagine what the Buddha's frustration must have been with this monk. He proclaims that no one should tell this monk that Sirma's dead, and he takes Sirma's body and he puts it in the charnel grounds. He doesn't cremate it, and he lays it out and says, "We're going to leave this body here for 4 days." So after 4 days, this corpse is looking pretty gnarly. It's bloated, all of her beauty is melted away, maggots are spewing out of every orifice. She has started like to have that kind of brown liquid come out of her. And the Buddha calls all of his disciples together, including the lovesick monk, and says, "We're going to go see Sirma." And of course, the lovesick monk is very, very excited. And so he comes along to go see the object of his affection. But when he gets there, he of course realizes that Sirma is dead, and he sees not this kind of beautiful woman he once knew, but instead this bloated, hideous corpse. So in front of this whole congregation of monks and lay people, the Buddha asks who will pay 500 gold to sleep with Sirma for one night. Of course, no one wants to sleep with a corpse, so no one takes that up. And then he says, and who will pay 400 gold? No one says anything. Eventually, he keeps lowering the price until finally he says, who will sleep with her for free tonight? And of course, no one does. And our little lovesick monk comes to realize that his error, he realizes that all this beauty decays and rots. And at this point, this woman who once commanded such high a price for her company is now being, no one will even sleep with her for free. So I think this is a great story. It's a very standard Buddhist truth about impermanence of the body, impermanence of the self, about the evils of desire and the kind of giving a state of permanence to impermanent things, all told in this very lurid fashion involving rotting corpses and dramatic declarations of love. And I think, of course, this is what narrative can do. It provides a sort of entertainment value, this kind of really dramatic element to it. But I did say that this was, I think, multi-layered. I think Buddhists can do more. I think st our stories can do more to teach the Buddhist Dharma and to provide this kind of multi-layered ideas. And what I mean by that is I think the story itself gives us the tools to actually think about these truths in a more complex way. The tradition, the story of Sirma itself gives us these ideas to ask hard questions about the historical context of early Buddhism and the gendered realities of what it means to be a woman. So Sirma herself, so she's the daughter of the courtesan Salavati. If you actually look at that, there's a larger story there of generational trauma, of women stuck in very difficult positions with little way out for them and their children. In the story of Sirma and Salavati, her mother, we see this idea of women who literally are able to only own their own bodies and they're able to use that to get by in the world. Additionally, in her death, we actually see Sirma losing control of her body. When I was preparing for this talk, I was reading some kind of modern Buddhist feminist takes on the story of Sirma. And in some of those, Sirma will give the Buddha permission to do this to her body. But in the earliest one, the Dhammapada, she doesn't. The Buddha just does this with her body after her death. So we also see there that this idea that women aren't in possession even of their body after their death. But also importantly, I think the story of Sirma is really interesting because it makes very clear whose fault it was that Sirma was so distracting to the monks. When I teach this particular story in my Buddhism and gender class, I often have students who really dislike it, who express their displeasure to me with the story and say that it's misogynistic, it's lurid, it is aggressively anti-woman because it's kind of talking about Sirma as this sort of very charming corpse. But I actually don't think you can read it that way. I think to me it's very clear that the story actually is very pro Sirma. And I think it's important that the Buddhist tradition does not blame Sirma for being beautiful or say that it's Sirma's fault that the monk that she has distracted the monk. The tradition is very clear that it's the monk's responsibility to hold to his vows, not Sirma's job to protect, the monk's vows. And I actually think that's a very powerful statement, especially at the time that this story was composed about 2,500 years ago. I think that's a very important statement, a very radical statement at that time. So that's what I mean when I say that narratives provide a way to elaborate on these kind of multi-layered truths. That there's, of course, the kind of basic reading of this is a story about impermanence, but as you get deeper, the story itself lets you kind of explore an early Buddhist world to kind of come up against things that are discomforting in the early Buddhist world, but also to how that early Buddhist ideas will challenge the larger world in which these stories are taking place. So that's my kind of first thing I want to say about narrative. The second thing I think about that stories do and that narratives do in teaching Buddhist truths is that narratives provide an intellectual space to react to the Dharma. I sometimes have talked about this in various writings as kind of an intellectual safe space. Often in a Buddhist story, we'll see a hero gently challenging the teachings or kind of working through the emotional implications of the teachings. And a lot of religious traditions do have this. So in the Jewish tradition, there's ideas of midrash, which are these kinds of playful stories created to comment on or provide an alternative interpretation of foundational religious truths. And I think something very similar is happening in a lot of Buddhist stories. As an example of this, I'm going to talk about the Gesar epic, especially the episode that's near and dear to my heart, the Nyeling Dzogpa Chenpo. This is the final episode of the Gesar epic. So, for those who might not be familiar, the Gesar epic is this kind of sprawling, living oral tradition that is popular across the Himalayas. It's especially popular in eastern Tibet. Um, so, in this, I often say that King Gesar is in some ways very similar to the kind of King Arthur. He's this kind of divinely sent king who's there to defend the practice of Buddhism and to help purify Buddhist practice from these demonic forces that are controlling it. I say this is a living epic tradition. There are still bards that perform the epic, and these bards often will actually enter into states of possession, where the epic itself kind of grabs hold of them, and they recite the epic kind of without their own volition. Now, within this kind of sprawling tradition, the Nyelling, or the kind of the final episode that I study, is where King Gesar goes to hell. So in this particular episode, it starts like all of them, where King Gesar is relaxing at his palace with his main wife Drukmo, but also his many courtesans and all the lovely women of his palace. And he's relaxing, and he gets a call that he must go meet with Padmasambhava. And then so he actually flies. He goes to meet with Padmasambhava. He goes through a series of purifications to prepare to meet with him. And Padmasambhava gives him initiations and makes him into a Buddhist teacher of the Dzogchen tradition, particularly the Longchen Nyingtik. And Padmasambhava tells Gesar, these are the highest Buddhist teachings. You must go take them back to your lands. So Gesar returns to his lands and he initiates all of the people of his kingdoms into Longchen Nyingtik teachings, giving specialized teachings for each different tribe. And as he's doing this, he kind of exhausts himself and decides he must go into meditative retreat so that he can kind of regain his spiritual powers. While in meditative retreat, his mother dies. And so Gesar performs his divination and discovers that his mother has been reborn in hell. Now, this is a big problem in the episode itself because his mother is a good Buddhist. It's very foundational, the idea that Gesar's mother is a very devout Buddhist. So she, by all means, should not be born in hell. So Gesar, in this kind of rage, leaps upon his flying horse and flies down to hell and confronts King Yama to find out why his mother is in hell. So what follows is this really cool, I kind of talk about with my students as like basically an epic rap battle. As he and King Gesar and King Yama share these songs with each other, each trying to like make a point and explain to the other what's going on. In the process of this, Gesar becomes outraged and he runs forward and tries to cut off Yama's head. This causes Yama to actually emanate a whole kind of mandala of different Buddhas. And in this, Gesar goes to cut off one of the Yama's head and realizes he actually is cutting off his own head. So in this moment, Gesar realizes that he fundamentally does not understand the Dharma. And Yama actually finishes by saying, in fact, your mother is in hell for your sins. And that is your sins of violence and killing that have put her there. So Gesar then says, I'm going to go save my mom in hell. And as he goes, he follows along this kind of path and is led by a servant of Yama through hell, seeing all these different punishments until he finally does get to the bottom of hell, to the worst hell, the Avicii hell. Avicii meaning that the hell where it means without waves. So there's no break to the suffering. So it's just constant torment. And there he does find his mother surrounded by all the men he's ever killed in battle. So to save her, he actually does have to save them. So it's a really cool story. But what I'm very interested in is the hell journey part. So as Gesar is going through hell, he's just had this kind of confrontation with Yama where he's been bested, and he's starting to kind of wonder that maybe he doesn't fully understand the Dharma, despite receiving these initiations from Padmasambhava earlier in the text. As he's going through hell, he's seen all these horrible tortures, and he keeps stopping and crying. And he will kind of take these moments where he starts to where he'll demand that to the people who are performing the punishments and say, how can you be doing these? How can you be engaging this type of violence? And they always respond back, well, we're just doing our jobs here. We're helping them. We're getting rid of their bad karma. And Geso doesn't really understand this, and he gets very, very angry. And at one point, he sings this very long song where he's about how he's going to lead an army of Buddhas into hell. He's going to conquer hell and destroy all of hell and stop this torture. And then the jailers kind of sing back this song about how they're going to defend hell because this is actually helpful. I think this is a really interesting moment because we're getting to see someone who the story has said is a very important Buddhist teacher, is an enlightened Buddhist teacher, having problems when they actually see the effects of karma. And I think what we see in this story is a way where karma, well, I think Gesar intellectually understands karma at the beginning. By this later point, I think it's acknowledging that you can understand karma, you can admit that karma is just, but to actually see its effects can be hard. And that's why he's called this story an intellectual safe space, where in many ways we're seeing the hero Gesar actually kind of working through this idea that karma is true and karma is real, and karma can also be really painful to see and to see the effects of. And I think that's something really unique that we see that narrative can do. It can provide this space in which you can kind of say karma is fucked up. You can kind of challenge karma a little bit. You can express your frustration with it in this space where because it's in a story, because it's in a narrative, you're not actually challenging Buddhist truths, not actually challenging foundational Buddhist doctrines. So narrative provides the space to express frustration and to vent and to say the Dharma might be true, but sometimes it's really hard to witness and it can be hard to hard to have to see. So for my third thing I want to talk about that like stories do, I think that stories also kind of can be this really important way to remind us of the ultimate humanity of the Buddhist tradition, to kind of help us as listeners, as readers, as viewers, kind of connect to these elements of the Buddhist tradition that are foundationally human. I always tell my students when I teach at Texas State that I think one of the best things that you can see with narratives uh, is there these little moments where you actually get to see someone being just as human as you are thousands of years ago. So I think about this with the story of the Buddhist demon Hariti. So this is a really another kind of very old Buddhist story, but this one became especially important in China and Japan. So in the story of Hariti, Hariti is this demoness who eats, who has like tons, hundreds and hundreds of children, and she feeds all these children the blood of kind of young children. That's their favorite snack. And so she's always going around stealing children and kind of bleeding them dry so that her children can eat. And one day the Buddha actually, so she's going around, she's killing all these people, all the towns are upset, and they all beg the Buddha, Buddha, you must help us. How do we stop this demoness from eating our children? And so the Buddha actually comes and steals her smallest, her newest child, and puts him under his bowl. And so Hariti, it becomes beside herself. She's so distressed. She's running around looking for a child. She's ripping out her hair. She's sobbing, and she comes before the Buddha, and the Buddha, says, "I have, what is wrong?" And she says, "Well, you've taken, I think that you've taken my child." And he, of course, says that he is not. But meanwhile, the child's in the little begging bowl. And eventually, Hariti she's talking to the Buddha, and eventually the Buddha says, I did take your child, but do you see how upset you were? You have hundreds of children and you lost one, but you are taking the children from people who you're taking their only child, or the child of when they only have two or three, and how much greater must their suffering be? And in this moment, Hariti kind of has this moment of realization and professes that she will protect the Buddhist doctrine, but that also she will stop stealing children to feed to her babies. And she actually then becomes this protector of children. And I think in that story, you see this really beautiful humanity there of this kind of demoness being transformed, uh, coming, this demoness who is coming to a realization of empathy and compassion through the narrative. And I think that that's really incredible. So similarly, I said I would talk about Serima and kind of how she became Buddhist. This is another kind of moment of humanity that I think is really cool in the story. The story really goes something like this. So before Serima becomes the great Buddhist Serima who gives meals to the monks every day, before that, she was just a beautiful courtesan. And in her town, there was a woman who was a devout Buddhist named Uttara. Uttara was married to a very wealthy man who cared nothing for the Buddhist faith. Now, every day, Uttara would prepare to go and listen to Buddhist teachings, but her husband would demand that Uttara stay and keep him company, and he would tempt her with fine wine and delicious food and lovely silks and all that stuff. Finally, Uttara had had enough, and with the help of her father, she basically pays Sirma to entertain her husband for 2 whole weeks so that she can spend those 2 weeks just studying the Dharma with the Buddha. And her husband, he must have thought what a wonderful gift this was. So Uttara goes off to go study the Buddhist Dharma for 2 weeks. At the end of it, she's going to come back and cook a giant meal for all the monks. So Sirma stays with Uttara's husband, and I'm sure they have a lovely time for 2 weeks. And on Sirma's last day with the husband, she noticed that Uttara's husband is looking out in the garden. And what the husband is seeing is he's seeing Uttara scurrying around and trying to get this meal ready for the monks and, sweeping and cleaning and basically doing a lot of work. And the husband laughs. And he's actually laughing at Uttara and saying, "Ah, this woman doesn't know how to enjoy life. She shouldn't be spending all this time making food for the monks. She should be, spending time with me." and enjoying all this fine food. And look what a lovely 2 weeks I had with this beautiful one, Sirma. But Sirma doesn't know that. Sirma thinks that the husband is actually laughing at Sirma. That the husband has thinks that Sirma is no longer as beautiful as Uttara. Um, so that Sirma thinks that her beauty is starting to slip, that she's no longer this beautiful courtesan anymore, but in fact that she's become kind of old and haggard. This makes Sirma very jealous. In a fit of jealousy, she grabs a pot of boiling oil and tries to pour it all over Uttara. But Uttara's presence of mind and her compassion for Sirma and the equanimity of her Buddhist practice actually keeps the oil from burning her. And in that moment, Sirma realizes the kind of power of the Buddhist teachings and becomes a Buddhist. I said that I think this story has a lot of humanity to it. And I think that what we're seeing there is this very kind of um, prickly character. You're seeing a person who, this type of story, or maybe not quite with the boiling oil and everything quite like that. You could almost see this happening between two friends at a party. This kind of the way that there's this misdirection of who the husband's actually laughing at, and the way that Sirma's prickly pride causes her to act out and to lash out. And I think that's something really powerful in narrative is we get to see reflections of ourselves, and we get to see characters who are as human as we are and struggling with very similar things. And I think this leads to the kind of last little story I want to talk about, which is the one depicted in Rinpoche's sixth painting. It's the story of Nanda and the Buddha. And I am going to share my screen because I don't know if everyone's got a chance to see this particular image. So I did, da, 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 put it on a little PowerPoint slide. Um, okay, I think that works here. Perfect. I'll make it take up the full screen. Perfect. Okay, so this is the sixth painting. This is Rinpoche's painting depicting the story of Nanda and the Buddha. You may be familiar with this. Nanda is the Buddha's half brother, and he's set to wed the most beautiful woman in the whole kingdom. On his wedding day, the Buddha, walks up to him because the Buddha wants him to be a monk. He doesn't want him to uh, he doesn't want him to get married and enter into householder life. So on the Buddha's wedding day, the Buddha walks up and he says nothing, but he just hands Nanda his begging bowl and then walks off. Now, Nanda knows it would be disrespectful not to return the bowl, and so he keeps trailing after the Buddha, trying to get the Buddha to take his bowl back. And so you see that there in that kind of top left corner, and I just like the way that Rinpoche has depicted this image with the Buddha kind of playfully and blithely just walking away. And of course, he knows Nanda's right behind him, but is like so pointedly not looking behind himself. So they get to the monastery, the Buddha finally turns around, takes his begging bowl, and then says, "Now, Nanda, it's your duty that you must become a monk." Nanda knows that he can't go against his older brother, so he says, "Okay, I'll be a monk." But he's actually a very miserable monk. He has this beautiful hot wife at home. Why is he here? He doesn't want to be a monk. So when the Buddha sees how miserable his brother is, he actually takes him on a series of journeys to convince him of kind of the impermanence of all things and also that his wife is not quite as beautiful as this guy thinks he is. So he shows him a kingdom of goddesses where each woman is more beautiful than the last. And Nanda's floored. By this point he's forgotten all about his lovely wife. In some version of the story, he takes him to uh, he takes him to like three different realms of goddesses, and each one is just more beautiful than the last one. Nanda's floored. He's forgotten all about his wife. The Buddha then shows Nanda a mangy monkey. So you see that right there in the middle. And Nanda says that after seeing the goddesses, his like beautiful wife is as abhorrent to him as this kind of mangy, ugly monkey. And to make sure his point gets home, because the Buddha wants to make sure Nanda's not going to backslide, the Buddha shows Nanda hell, which as you can see, Rinpoche is drawn there in the corner. And this is another point where I think we kind of see this humanity in these stories. I like the expression that we see on Nanda's face and how the Buddha is actually kind of holding Nanda by his like robe and kind of like dangling him over hell. Because the Nanda story is fairly cut and dry, but within it, there's a lot of room for playfulness, a lot of room for these sort of playful, fun depictions of the Buddha. We get to see the Buddha in almost a trickster mode. We get to see the Buddha in a kind of a little bit more of a playful teasing mode. I think the story with the monkey is a very teasing element to this, and that shows there's a lot of like very deep humanity at the level of this story. So you can, and I think that this is an important element of narrative, that narrative provides a way to kind of retain and to retain this kind of humanity, but also to invite people into thinking about the tradition in different ways. So, in this space, we discover in the space of narrative, we actually discover this kind of very human characters. Like we see with Sirma, that kind of prickly pride that she has that causes her to try to maim Uttara with oil. And I think this is really an important element of narrative in the Buddhist tradition. So with that, I'm going to end because I didn't want this to be a conversation. I'm interested in hearing people's questions or talking more about whatever they would like, or also if people do have their favorite Buddha stories to share. I'm happy to do so. So let me unshare my screen. So how do I do that? I am so bad. Aha, there it is. Got it. Excellent. So, I'm happy to talk about questions or kind of see if there's more things that we want to discuss, and discuss various like our favorite kind of Buddhist stories.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you very much for the overview and the comparisons. Very interesting. I'd be curious about this, what you defined as a rap battle when Gesar goes down to confront Yama about his mother's being placed in hell, about his mother being placed in hell. But I don't know how easy it is to access all that. But just for the future, I make
Yeah.
a mental note about that. Very interesting.
But a lot of this is kind of about the unique style. The Gesar epic is written in what's called a chanta fabla style, which means this sort of very fast periods of prose interspersed with these long, expansive songs. And every character in the epic has their own melody, and the songs are really where the important stuff happens. The prose is just like kind of moving pieces around. And so the songs are where Yama and Gesar are actually having their discussion about what's important.
I mean, I think Gesar is the perfect example of how Buddhist or in any case spiritual messages get portrayed across for a general public. No, I mean I think what you've told several of these stories or even this painting, they're an easy way for people to act compared to sometimes going and reading complicated sutras or tantras, which are quite an effort
Yeah.
to read unless you or listening to a long teaching by Rinpoche. This is very immediate, straight to the point, easy to understand. I mean, that's the beauty of art and words in general. So yeah, it's an
Yeah.
interesting way to communicate it.
During one of my fieldwork experiences, I was traveling with a friend who was trying to meet with various lamas about this very particular tantric text. And we would, we'd be in a car for days on bumpy roads trying to get to this lama. We'd get there, and my friend would, after kind of pleasantries, would always ask about this tantric text. It would kind of, he would be met with this sort of like this kind of shrug or like, well, yeah, that's an important text. And he would be like, it'd be like pulling teeth to try to get more information about this. Um, and then I was traveling with him just to kind of be out in the field. So I would always say at the end, the Lama would always ask like, oh, well, what are you studying? I'd say the Gesar epic. And it became very frustrating to my friend because then they would just nonstop talk about the gay stuff. They talk about their favorite episodes. They would talk about their favorite characters, and we would be there for another hour just talking about the Gesar epic. And my friend kept saying, like, I thought tantras were supposed to be the important part of Buddhist practice, um, and they are. But the Gesar epic is, I think, as you said, kind of more direct and to the point, and can be more entertaining.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if anybody from the audience has any specific question for Natasha, or as she said, if anybody would care to share any particular episode. I don't know how familiar with specific tantras, or I know I saw amongst the audience we have Christine Blanc, who's an expert about Milarepa. She wrote a massive volume, 600 plus pages about
That's
Milarepa, which of
wonderful.
course is another perfect example of narratives and poems and stories so beloved to Tibet. I think probably Gesar and Milarepa are the two most beloved. So, I mean, I think there's plenty of parallels, especially about death, which is also your specialty. I'm wondering, Natasha, if maybe you have other stories about death, which perhaps from Gesar you could share, um, like this
Um,
story of him going to Yama, or if there are other ones. I remember, I haven't read much myself, but I remember lots of battles and, sort of enemies and
Yes. I was actually thinking about this. We just recently had the American Academy of Religion Conference, which is the national conference. That's kind of the largest conference in America where Tibetan scholars interested in Tibetan culture gather. It's usually the American Academy of Religion and the American Association of Asian Studies, or the Association of Asian Studies. Um, and as part of that, we actually did a memorial for Michael Yum, who was a young Tibetanist, a young Tibetologist, who had just started a postdoc in Vienna and had a kind of catastrophic heart failure, and unfortunately passed away. So we did a memorial for him. And again, kind of thinking about this kind of pairing of stories, and kind of how they can speak to various, the kind of humanity in various life events. Um, as part of his memorial, I was telling this one story about Gesar, um, where he uh apparently it's called about the demon of the north is the kind of name of the story, and basically there's this demonic figure up in the north of his kingdom, and of course he's raging and destroying Buddhism. So Gesar goes to go conquer him, and he's a giant, he's a big giant troll, and Gesar goes to go defeat him, but when he gets there, the giant's not there, only the giant's wife. And the giant's wife thinks Gesar is very, very handsome, and so she starts slipping him poison to keep him there and to trap him there. And so Gesar drinks the poison, forgets all about Ling and his wife Drukmo and all the kind of people there, and forgets all about that, and instead just falls in love and lives with the kind of the troll's wife. And he's doing this for several years. And actually, everyone in Ling is wondering where Gesar is. And finally, his older brother Gyatso says, "I'm going to go save Gesar. Something terrible must have happened." So Gyatso goes and rides off to go get Gesar, and along the way, encounters his own set of demons and gets killed, and he gets reborn as a raven. But he still remembers he has a job, and his job is to save Gesar. So as a raven, he flies over to the demons, to the demon's mansion, and then he shits into the mouth of Gesar. So Gesar's looking up, looking at the raven, and then Gyatso, as a raven, poops into Gesar's mouth, and Gesar's so disgusted he vomits immediately, and out that vomits up the poison, and then remembers, oh wait, I had a job I was supposed to be here doing. And I think that story is actually, I was telling the story in the context of Michael Yum's memorial because thinking about when a hero dies too soon, or when someone dies unexpectedly, because Gyatso's death is mourned throughout Ling. You know, he was, of course, a kind of a young hero, one of these kind of 30 warriors of Ling that Gesar surrounded himself with. And I think that speaks to the kind of poignancy of this narrative, and this idea that even in death, Gyatso's helping Gesar. And we were talking about with kind of the death of our friend Michael, and like how even in death, how is Michael kind of speaking to us or teaching us, or what legacy had he left behind? And sometimes that legacy might be like raven shit in your mouth, and not necessarily be the kind of most pleasant one, but might be the most trickster one. Um, so I think that story is I particularly like that story. It's a very interesting way to kind of portray death, but also to portray reincarnation. What I also think is interesting, and I've talked about this in some of my writing with that particular story, is that it runs counter to the way traditional Buddhist ideas of reincarnation work. There is no 49-day period. There's no Bardo. There's no um, it is a kind of a simplification of traditional Buddhist ideas of reincarnation in a way that makes sense for the narrative, but that ultimately accomplishes the goals of the narrative.
right. Thank you, Natasha. Is there
So.
anybody in the audience with any question, or is it everybody shy? Or if you want to type something, or maybe you, Natasha, have something, some other point to add to it?
No, I'm trying to think whether like I think I think one of the kind of powerful things about narrative, especially a sprawling narrative like the Gesar epic, or even like the Buddhist tradition, I think because a lot of the narratives in the Buddhist tradition they all kind of connect to each other, and I think that that's I think we see that with even the story of like we were talking about Sirma, how Sirma is actually also connected to Uttara, who's also connected to this person, and I think they all kind of connect in that way, and I think that this is an important element that makes um, narrative and especially epic narrative like the Gesar epic, a kind of world in which people can experiment with ideas, and a world in which people can kind of play out and talk about different ideas. And I think that's really significant. And I think that's something that unique that narrative does. And narrative does, I think, I would say in any religious tradition, but especially in the Buddhist tradition.
That's what I was just about to ask you. What would you say are the specific characteristics of Buddhist narrative, as opposed, you mentioned you grew up as a Roman Catholic, for example, or from your cross-religious studies. Which would you say are the main characteristics within Buddhist narrative?
I think Buddhist narratives often, I mean, the types of things that they are teaching are obviously specifically Buddhist. So the kind of I'm thinking about in comparison to a lot of kind of Catholic saint stories. In Buddhism, there's always that kind of the through line of impermanence is important, or kind of that um, the nature of reality is this kind of constant change and impermanence. Whereas when thinking about other types of stories in other religious traditions, especially in like the kind of Catholic examples that I was giving, they might emphasize impermanence, but then they would always be like, but God is permanent everywhere. But kind of like the kind of the punchline is different, you might say. I also find that um, I think that there's playful elements in many religious traditions, but I think that the because Buddhism spreads so very widely, and in so many different cultures, and I think among different kinds of um, in religious studies, we sometimes talk about the three great missionizing religions. So Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism in comparison to Islam and Christianity, Buddhism really changed, like molded itself into local cultures at a much kind of more, at a greater level than, say, Christianity and Islam. So that's the reason Japanese Buddhism looks very, very, very different than Indian Buddhism. And I think because of that, you get this very broad, like very, very broad ideas of what a Buddhist, like of what a good Buddhist is in different narratives. And I think that diversity makes the kind of corpus of Buddhist literature and Buddhist narrative literature really interesting.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. More local elements, of course.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Okay, well, if nobody has any particular points to raise, or unless you want to add something more, Natasha, then I think we can thank you. And yeah, wish you the best with your future work and
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you all for having me.
research on Gesar. And thank you, everybody. And next month, we'll have a talk by Michael Smith. No, sorry, Malcolm Smith. We haven't announced it yet, but he's done some work on the Jur Sound Tantra. So more info coming about that soon. So thank you again, Natasha. Thank you, everybody. Wish you a nice Saturday wherever you are, and all the best. Thank you, Natasha. Bye bye,
Excellent. Thank
everybody.
you. Bye.